Hey everybody, welcome to the second part of the Camera Basics Workshop. I'm Paul DeBurgis. I see a lot of familiar people on the chat already, so welcome back, glad to see you. Just a couple of things. Again, I'm going to spare you the introduction and the bio. If you want to know more about who I am, there's a link just above that says Paul's bio. If you're looking at it on the ColorBandit page, you'll be able to download a PDF that tells you a little bit about me. Also, it's been on here, but I have forgotten to mention it. Below the PDFs that are right around where the PDFs are for the downloads for the workshop notes, there's a link to a survey. And I'd appreciate if you are interested in giving me some feedback about the workshops so far, especially if you've attended several, then please feel free to fill out that survey. I would get a lot of good information from that. So again, if you will help me out by typing your questions in bold, and yes, Deb, we are recording right now, so thanks for that reminder. Also, if you would text in, hi Pam, text in, tell me your city if you haven't already done so. Tell me your camera type, as in smartphone or point and shoot or DSLR, so I get an idea of the type of camera that the audience is using. So that would be really great. And I want to congratulate Mike Kaplan for winning KRDO's Moon Photo Contest. Mike is going to get a tour of the studio during a news broadcast, and that should be cool. And if we can hook this up, I'm going to go down to the studio and meet up with Mike at the same time, so I'll get a chance to meet the winner. So that was really great. So let's get into it. If you've already downloaded the PDF, then you're ready to go. Remember last week we talked about the three variables involved in capturing an exposure. Those were the ISO, or that was the light sensitivity of the image sensor itself. And you could think of that as a volume control on your AM radio. If you're in town and you have a very strong signal, you don't have to turn the volume up to get a really good sound, and you don't really have any static in the background. If you're out in the country or you're trying to pull in a distance signal, then as you crank up the volume, you get more static and hiss and everything in the background. And that's what ISO is like in the digital camera. If you have it set at its base setting, it's not very sensitive to light, so you can shoot in bright sunlight and get a well-exposed picture. If you go into a darker setting, then cranking that light volume up will give you more bang for the buck in terms of the available light, but it also give you a little bit more static and a little bit more noise and graininess to the picture, so there's that trade-off. The second variable that we talked about was the aperture of the lens. And again, I've got my lens from last week here, so I'll hold this up, and you can see right now there's a pretty good size opening in the lens. The lens aperture is open all the way, but as you stop the lens down, that's the term. Well, this one is locked. I got to unlock it. As you stop the lens down, you can see here that opening is really tiny. And I can now open it and close it manually. Let's see if I can get a good picture in there. Hopefully you can see, yeah, there we go, the aperture closing and opening. So the key to this variable was, obviously when it's open very large, you let a lot of light in. And the benefit to doing that is you get a faster shutter speed, great for low light situations. And we talked a lot about depth of field. And that was the amount of the scene that is in focus or out of focus, pleasantly so if it's a portrait and you're trying to create that effect. If you stop the lens down to have a very small opening, then you get extreme depth of field where everything from near to far is in focus, and that's great for landscape shots. So the third variable that we talked about was shutter speed. And depending on the type of camera you have, you may have a mechanical shutter that actually, a mechanical device that opens and closes, or if it's an electronic, if it's a point and shoot or a smartphone camera, then what you have is the image sensor turns on and turns off very quickly. And shutter speeds in normal shooting are in fractions of a second, like a 1/60th of a second, or 1/100th, or 1/500th of a second. And typically those are fast enough that you can handhold the camera and you can get a reasonably clear picture. If the shutter speeds get longer, like a half second or 1 second, or even 2 minutes or 2 hours, then obviously you have to put the camera on a tripod so that it doesn't shake and not subject to any kind of vibrations to keep the picture clear. We also talked about the concept of stops, which is kind of a unit of measure, and you don't really have to worry about what that means, other than as you increase a setting by a factor of 2, you change that setting by 1 stop. If you cut the setting back by a factor of 2, you reduce that setting by 1 stop. So for example, with shutter speed, if you start with a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, and you increase the shutter speed by 1 stop, that would mean that you change it from 1/100th of a second to 1/200th of a second. And then if you wanted to increase it again by another stop, you would go from a 200th to a 400th, and from a 400th to an 800th, and from an 800th to a 1600th. So every time you double it or cut it in half, that's a change of 1 stop. So that kind of summarizes where we were at with last week. And again, you can download the show file, the workshop notes for last week, and the recording is also there from last week. So let's continue on now and talk about one more variable that we have with our cameras that has to do to some degree with the exposure, and that is white balance. Now, in the film days, when you bought your film, you bought film that was especially intended for either daylight, and it said that on the box, it said daylight, or you may have bought your film if you were shooting indoors for incandescent lighting or tungsten lighting, which is the material that the filament in the light bulb is made out of. And that film was especially formulated to react to the different colors of what we see as white light. Okay, so let's get into that for just a second. When we are in the kinds of scenes that we're in every day, whether it's outside, a sunny day, bright sun, cloudy day, in the shade, maybe indoors, and we've got tungsten lights or the traditional light bulb, or maybe the light that exists is light that's coming from the burner of a hot air balloon, or a candle, or a campfire. All of those light sources throw off light that is tinted to some degree, and you may or may not notice that with your eye, but the camera sensor definitely notices it. And so I want to just do a little experiment here with these 2 flashlights, and I'm going to shine these in your eyes. They won't be too bright, but hopefully you can see a slight color difference between the 2 lights. The one right here may look a little red, and the one right here may look maybe pure or white or even a little bit blue. So hopefully you can see that difference in these lights. Now, these are 2 flashlights. What's the difference? Well, this light is a more traditional flashlight that has a small incandescent bulb inside, and the light that it puts out comes from that incandescent bulb. Incandescent light is typically more red or orange to the camera sensor. This flashlight is an LED flashlight, and so that LED is trying to approach a more natural white light, and I'll define that for you in just a second. But that's why this one looks a little bit blue in comparison to the one that I first had up there. So hopefully you were able to see the difference in the light tone, and that's exactly what we're talking about with white balance. When you're in a setting where the primary and predominant light source is from incandescent light bulbs, from the traditional light bulb that has a tungsten filament, what you're seeing is the scene bathed in kind of a reddish tint light. Now, you are used to seeing that. You don't really perceive necessarily the redness in that light, but the camera does. And so when you take a picture in that scene, your picture may come out with some kind of an orange or red tint to it. And maybe you've seen that in some of your pictures. Why does this look red? Why does this look orange? Well, that's why, because most likely the light source was primarily from tungsten filament type light bulbs, and that light color is a more reddish tint. If you're outside in daylight at noon and it's a clear sky and there's nothing in the way of the sun and you're in the sun, that is what the camera manufacturers have decided is going to be their normal reference white light. So if you're shooting in a scene that's, like I said, high noon, unobstructed, bright, clear sky, then you probably will, your picture will probably be pretty natural in terms of the lighting, unless you have your white balance set to a different setting, whether you did that on purpose or that's part of one of the scene modes, which we'll get into shortly. So daylight, unobstructed, high noon type sun is what we consider to be the reference light, white light for the camera. As you get into the shade, or if the sun is obscured by clouds and you have a cloudy day, the light tends to get a little bit bluer. And the reason for that is because, you know, the sky is blue, and that's because the atmosphere reflects and scatters blue light. So when you're in the shade, or if you're in a cloudy situation, you have all this reflected, scattered light, which tends to have a blue tint to it, and you don't have any of the direct sunlight that contains the other colors to offset that. So again, if you take a picture in that kind of a setting and your white balance is not set for that, then you may get a little bit of a bluish tint in your pictures. So if you take a look at the handout, the workshop notes, at the bottom of the first page, there's a graph. And what you see is kind of a spectrum that goes from red to a white bar in the middle and goes all the way over to blue on the other side. And you see some symbols. There's a candle, there's a light bulb, you have the sun partially obscured by some clouds, and then you have a full cloud with a raindrop, giving you an idea of the light sources from reddish, most red, to most blue, the way your camera would see them. So for example, a candle or a campfire, or the rays of the sun right as it's peeking over the horizon at sunrise or sunset. That's probably going to be the reddest light that the camera is going to see. And then as you move through incandescent light bulbs, and then you get to the bright, unfiltered noonday sun, that's where you have the balanced spectrum, if you will, and the camera perceives that as normal light. And then it moves over into the more bluer sections. Now at the bottom of that graph, you'll also see some what look like temperature numbers, and that's actually a color temperature. And if you get into this deeper, I'm not really going to get into that right now because I think that's a little bit beyond the basic nature of this class tonight. But we actually measure the color temperature of light. So if your color temperature is around 2,000 degrees Kelvin or 3,000 degrees Kelvin, that's very reddish light. Normal daylight is considered to be around 5,000 to 6,000 degrees Kelvin. And as you get up into the bluer end of the spectrum, you get into the 7, 8, 9,000 degrees Kelvin range. So if you see those settings in a custom white balance in your camera menu, that's really what it's talking about. But what you really want to understand is that if you're at a candle or a light bulb, it's reddish, daylight is pretty well balanced, and cloudy can be very bluish. And when we're talking about a white balance setting with the camera, what we're saying is, if you're shooting, say, in incandescent light bulbs where there's a preponderance of red, if you use the incandescent light bulb white balance setting, the camera is going to add a little bit of blue to offset that extra red, or kind of balance it out. Same thing on the other end of the spectrum. If you're shooting on a cloudy day and you use the cloudy day setting, the camera is going to add a little bit of red to offset the excess of blue that's present, and again, balance it out. If you're shooting daytime and you've got it on the daylight setting, And the camera really isn't going to add anything either way, because you, again, have a pretty well balanced set of colors in that type of lighting. So when we talk about white balance, what we're saying is, what's the basic, what's the primary source of the light, and can we balance that out? Do we need to balance that out, first of all? And if we do, what setting do we use so that we can balance that? Light bulb's going off. Great, Pam, I'm glad to hear it. Because this is actually a topic that a lot of people find confusing, and so hopefully I'm clarifying this for you. So the white balance setting is just there so that it can give you a more natural appearance in the photo. And I've got some examples in the handout. We'll get to those in just a second. If you go to the second page of the workshop notes, you'll see some icons or some symbols that you might find in your camera white balance menu. And white balance, some cameras have 12 or 15 different presets, and then also the ability for you to set your own or even to tweak the presets that they offer you. So it can get really complicated, and again, I'm not trying to complicate it in this session, but I just wanted to show you a few of the basics that are there that you may stumble across in your menus as you're going through those. So the automatic white balance is the one that's on top of the list, and that's the one where the camera tries to figure out what kind of scene you're shooting in and then apply the right kind of correction if any is needed. So that you could think of as the most automatic kind of white balance setting. And if you're in more or less daylight conditions, then the automatic white balance many times works really well. As you get nearer to either end of the red or the blue, you may find that it doesn't work exactly as well as it might in other situations. So you just need to experiment a little bit with it. The next one down is that upside down light bulb, and that's the incandescent tungsten. And again, it adds a little bit of blue to offset the excess of red. The daylight setting is that sun icon, and that's the one that applies the least amount of correction because it already assumes that the light is pretty well balanced. The next one, fluorescent, is the trickiest one. And the problem there is there are different kinds of fluorescent tubes, and some put off different tints. Some are very blue, some are somewhat green, some are red, and fluorescent lighting can really cause some headaches sometimes when it comes to white balance. And one of the things that I've found in the corporate event and government event shooting that I do is a lot of these hotel ballrooms have fluorescent fixtures, and they also have incandescent like track lights or spotlights and that kind of thing. So I've got some light that's coming at the scene that is kind of reddish, and I've got other light that's coming at the scene that's any kind of weird, wacky fluorescent tube color. And so I have all these different base colors going on, and it's very difficult to find any one setting that will work for all of those different types of lights. So depending on which is the more powerful light source, I have to make some decisions about how I set. And I honestly, I don't even worry about white balance when I'm shooting because I shoot in RAW, and that's a completely different topic, a completely different workshop. So don't worry about that. But that ability for me to shoot in RAW allows me to do some really cool things later on after I get back to my office and I'm processing those pictures. And you'll see the effect of some of that here in these coming shots. The next icon is the cloudy white balance setting, again, where it adds a little bit of red to offset some of the blue. And then the last one is most cameras have the ability to do a custom white balance. So what you do there is you have some reference, like a white card. You can spend a lot of money on reference cards that have different shades of white, gray, black, that kind of thing. And you take a picture of it, and then you tell your camera, okay, this is what I want you to see as white light, and it will do the automatic adjustment for white balance. And that you can really get scientific and complicated and sophisticated with that. Many times what I do is I just have a 5x7 white index card that has a very flat finish, so I'm not getting a glare or anything off of it. And I'll take a picture of that in the light setting that I rely on. that is present, and I'll use that to key my white balance settings later on when I process my pictures. So now at the bottom of that page, there's a question. I can't find my white balance settings. Where are they? If you're shooting in a scene mode, and we're going to get into scene modes in just a second, but if you're shooting in a scene mode, the scene mode has already factored the white balance in. That's part of what's in the scene mode. So if you're looking for where those settings are in your camera, put your camera on, if you have them, one of the more manual settings like PASM, or if you have a Canon camera, A would be AV and S would be TV. Okay, so use one of those manual or semi-automatic settings, and then you will find the white balance icons that are available in your camera, because the white balance then is broken out, and you set that manually just like you would set some of the other exposure variables in the picture you're about to take. So again, if you're in scene mode, all this talk about white balance has already been factored in. So I'm going to pause for just a second, look at the screen and see if there are any questions related to white balance. If you have some right now, feel free to type them in, and I'll do my best to answer them. So I don't see any up there right now, so I'll keep an eye as if anybody types them in, I'll work backwards and address those. If you go to the third page of the workshop notes, you'll see a couple of pictures of some hot air balloons that I took last weekend when I was down in Albuquerque. There are 3 pictures of, they're exactly the same picture. And what I did, the only difference between one picture and the other is the white balance setting. Now you're going to say, how did you take the same picture with 3 different white balance settings? Well, again, this comes back to where I shoot in RAW. I shoot in a mode where the camera does the first part of the job. It collects and focuses the light, but it doesn't do any of the processing. I take the ones and zeros, that raw image file, if you will, think of it as the digital negative, and I offload that from my memory card onto my computer, and I use different kinds of software to process those pictures, much like a photochemical darkroom when we were back in the film days. Okay, so instead of using light and chemicals, I'm using ones and zeros and computer software to help me process that. So I was able to apply a white balance setting after the fact and not really have to worry about where I was set based on the conditions. So that's how I got this series of pictures that you'll see, because shooting in RAW separates the collecting and focusing light from processing the picture and creating something that you can either view on your screen or send to Walgreens or Walmart or your photo finisher and have a printout made. So the top picture is using the standard daylight setting. It's if you're paying attention to these kind of variables, it's about 5200K in terms of color temperature. The picture in the middle, the one below it, is using the cloudy day setting for white balance, and you can see that's much redder than the top, if you will, reference picture. And that's because the cloudy day setting adds red to offset extra blue. Okay? The bottom picture is one taken using the tungsten, the light bulb, the incandescent light setting. And you can see that one is way too blue. And the reason for that is because, again, the white balance for tungsten adds blue to offset what it expects to see in the way of extra red. So if you ever took some pictures and you noticed them being way too red or way too blue or way too green just overall, one of the first things I would look at is, if you were in a semi-automatic or a manual mode, did you have the right white balance selected? And if you were in a scene mode, perhaps you were using the wrong scene mode for that particular setting. Okay, so that's kind of how you can troubleshoot. And that's why I want to go into this, because as we get into these scene modes, you'll understand kind of what's under the covers there and understand how they work. If you go to page 4, you see this is a concert. That band is called Stealing Angels, and I took those pictures at the Pikes Peak Center, downtown Colorado Springs. Again, the top picture is the picture that I call my reference picture. Now, I had to use custom white balance on this particular picture to get it the way I wanted, to get it the way that I thought reflected the reality that I remembered. And the reason for that was this is one of those situations where you had many different colors of light. You had, if you look up at the top of the picture, you can see some of those spotlights. They were kind of reddish. There was a really good light on the flag in the background, and that was sending off some red. There were also blue and green and other colors of light in addition to the white spotlights that were on the entertainers themselves. So I had all kinds of light color going on, and I had to find the right white balance setting that I had to create my own rather than finding one of the presets. And again, I did this on the computer. I didn't do this in my camera. I did this in the computer once I got back to the office after I shot this event. So two other samples there. The middle picture is the standard setting for tungsten and incandescent light. And you may think that one looks better, it looks okay, it looks close, but one of the telltale signs for me is that I know that floor was painted black. And you can see that that floor in that middle picture kind of has a blue tint to it. And also if you look in some of the shaded areas, specifically the one entertainer who's got the singer who's got her hand in the air, there's a shadow on her back, and that shadow area has a blue tint to it. May not be as easy to see in that smaller picture as compared to when I have it blown up on the screen, but you can definitely see it there. So I knew I was a little bit too blue with that setting, and then obviously the daylight setting was much too red for that particular scene. So again, this shows you the different white balance settings that can be applied to a picture and how they affect it. Same thing if you go to page 5 and you see some pictures. This was at a Chamber of Commerce event. That setting is the Carriage Museum at the Broadmoor Hotel. And again, you've got the bottom picture here is the custom white balance that I had to fine tune. The top two pictures, again, using daylight and tungsten, and you can see the difference there. Now, I mentioned that I'll use a white index card, and I'll take a picture of the white index card and use that to key my white balance settings. Another little trick that I do sometimes is, many times at these corporate events, people are wearing white dress shirts. There are white tablecloths. There, in this particular picture, if you look on the right side, you see the Colorado flag, and there's a white section of the flag that shows. I look for these areas of what I know are or should be white, and I will key off of those areas to set my white balance, and that helps me a lot. So if I didn't happen to use that white index card at that particular time, again, the software that I use allows me to do that. And Mom, I see your question here. I only shoot in RAW as well. How about shooting snow to make it white, not blue or gray? Snow is a really tricky situation. For one thing, the gray part is because when your camera exposes, when the light meter reads a scene, it's assuming that you want it to be kind of balanced between bright and dark. And so things that normally should be very bright, if they are predominant in your scene, like snow would be, I mean, you know, when you take a picture of a snowy scene, there's snow all over. So the camera thinks that that snow should be in the middle range of bright to dark, when really we know it should be really bright, it should be white. So when we get to the scene modes, one of the things that I'll tell you is that the scene mode for snow will tend to overexpose the picture by 1 or 2 stops. And that's how the snow goes from gray to white. So from getting snow from gray to white is not necessarily a white balance, that's more an exposure issue. So think about that as you're exposing, and you may have to apply some exposure compensation. You may have to lengthen the shutter speed by a stop or 2 from where the camera wants to set it to get snow to look white. Now, from the standpoint of it looking blue versus white, again, think about the blue sky, and that blue light is reflecting off the snow. So you may need to apply, from the standpoint of white balance, a little bit of extra red to compensate for the blue sky reflecting off the snow. So that's one of the advantages of shooting in RAW, is that you can make those adjustments on the fly after you've taken the picture and still end up with an excellent image from the standpoint of image quality and all that. Tim, what's a good setting for sunrises and sunsets? Well, here's where you can get creative. Here's where you can have a lot of fun. You certainly could use the daylight setting, and you'll get pretty much the colors that you would expect. It's going to look a little bit red. But if you really want to play with this, you could use the cloudy day setting, which adds red to offset what it thinks is blue, and you can make an otherwise red really look warm and really look rich, even to the point of oversaturating and making it too red and too rich. So you could play around with this. So try daylight and then try the cloudy day and see what that does for you. Same thing the other direction, back to the snow scene. If you want to make a scene look really cold and frigid, you can use the tungsten light bulb setting, which adds blue. Whenever a picture has that blue tint, it always feels much colder. So even if you get your white snow that you want, you can add a little bit of blue in there and make it look really icy and frigid, and just create a kind of a mood with that tint either way. Very warm if you add reds, very cold and icy if you add blue. So Tim, hope that answers your question. Deb asked me, what software do I use? My DSLRs are Nikon cameras, and I use View NX, which is Nikon software that is kind of the image cataloging and viewing and grading and ranking and categorizing. And then I use Capture NX to actually process my pictures. I do not own Photoshop. I don't use Photoshop. I don't try to do special effects or things like that for the most part. The extent of my processing is to make my pictures look as natural and as real as they looked if you had been there in person to see that scene. So, and I don't, there is one time that I'll tell you this later, just in the interest of time, but there is one time that I had to take the head off of someone and put it on somebody else's body. There's a story behind that, but I do have the tools that I could do that with as well. But for the most part, my processing has to do with making the picture look more like the actual scene. So cool. So somebody's taken and moved heads around too, it looks like. Very cool. So then if you go to the handout, page 6, this is not an example of white balance. This is an example of color saturation. Oh, I love that, Timmy. And here's an example where the top picture, you've got the balloon and the mountain. The color saturation is normal. Didn't change the way it came out of the camera. The second picture in the middle is with very low saturation, so you can see the colors are muted. And then the bottom picture is where the colors are very bright, very vibrant, almost to the point of being oversaturated and not looking natural. And the reason that I put that in there is because saturation is another processing variable that you can many times set in a menu inside in your camera. And when you're in the scene mode is one of the features that is also applied. So we've mentioned scene modes a lot of times now, so I'm going to turn over to page 7 of the handout, and let's talk about what scene modes are. We've mentioned that the camera, in the old days, in the film days, the camera focused and collected light, and then you had a second step that was a photochemical process that actually developed the picture into a print or to a slide. With digital cameras, all of that can be done inside of the camera. And the scene modes are there because you have shutter speed and ISO and aperture and white balance and saturation and sharpening and noise reduction, and you have all these different settings. And until you understand how they all work, I mean, you'd be frozen in paralysis and not know what to set all those settings on. So the engineers who designed your camera want to make it easy for you to buy their camera and, and obviously sell more product. So they created these scene modes that automate all of this, and they make all the decisions for you. And as digital cameras have grown more sophisticated and the computers and processing power inside has gotten more powerful, the engineers have been able to do more with these scene modes. And so if you look at that diagram in the middle of the page, that's one where I did an internet search on the term scene mode, and I came up with, that's one particular camera and has all those scene modes for all those different kinds of environments and settings and situations. So, I mean, and here's the difficult thing about scene modes is with all of the searching and all of the research and everything that I've done, I haven't been able to find the camera manufacturer who will actually tell me the recipe that they use for each of their scene modes. So for example, a landscape scene mode, okay? I can't tell what the engineers programmed to create that landscape scene mode. But what I can do is, with just the things that we've talked about in part 1 and here in part 2, I can make some educated guesses about what's in each of those scenes. So again, back to the landscape mode. We know that with a landscape picture, you probably want to have extreme depth of field. You want everything from near to far to be in focus. So we know that from the standpoint of aperture, we need a small opening in the lens, a small aperture. So that's one of the presets we know is built into a scene mode. You may also want a higher degree of color saturation because you want the scene to look vibrant. You want the leaves to pop, the colors to pop. If there are flowers or blue sky or green waves of grass or whatever, you want all those colors to pop. So they've probably programmed some degree of color saturation in there too. I would think that the shutter speed would probably be something that the camera was free to adjust. Again, you're probably shooting outside, daylight, so shutter speed is not necessarily an issue in that situation. ISO, again, because you've got plenty of light, you could probably shoot down at a lower ISO, although ISO is a variable that probably would float to give you a shutter speed fast enough so that you didn't get a blurry picture. So that's an example of how I might deconstruct a scene mode based on what I know about the different exposure variables and the different controls that exist in the camera. Another scene mode that's very common is the portrait scene mode. This is the one where, you know, you're taking a picture of a person, and from our examples last week, we talked about that shallow depth of field where your subject is in sharp focus, but the background goes out of focus very quickly. And the way you achieve that is with a large aperture, a large opening in the lens. So we know that pretty good chance that that's something that the engineers programmed into the scene mode so that you could get that shallow depth of field effect. The other thing that they may have programmed into a portrait mode is probably they wouldn't over sharpen the picture, because if you over sharpen a portrait, that's where you begin to put the skin flaws, you know, wrinkles and all the things that we don't really want to see in our own portraits. So they may not make that sharpness setting very high, so it gives you a kind of a soft effect and takes away some of the effect of aging or other things in skin and in faces and that we don't necessarily find attractive. So again, engineers had to make some decisions about what to put in those scene modes. And so in the handout, I've got some additional modes there that describe that where I've made my best educated guess as far as how that mode works. A sports mode, for example, I'm sure that they have a very high shutter speed in a sports mode because you want to freeze the action, and you can only do that with a high shutter speed. And if it's kind of dark, then obviously you have to increase the ISO to maintain a high shutter speed in a darker environment, like inside gymnasium at a basketball game rather than outside at a soccer or football or baseball game. So there are some ways that you can understand how those different scene modes work. And from that, you can then begin to go into the more semi-automatic or manual modes as you want to take more control over your camera and you want to learn what those different settings do. And one thing that I want to show you, and thanks to those folks who tuned in early to to help me decide if I wanted to do this or not. But here I've got my, my Canon point and shoot, and this is something that I really encourage you to do. When it comes to the scene modes and to white balance, you don't have to listen to me tell you what they're going to do. You can actually see what they're going to do by taking pictures. You know, set your camera up outside or in the house or wherever you want to take some pictures, and take a picture in scene mode number 1, and then change the scene mode and take another picture, and same thing with white balance. Just experiment on the same scene in the same setting and see what the different scene modes do. And one of the features of this camera is, and many digital cameras will do this, so it's very likely that your point and shoot will do this too. You don't even have to take the picture. If you look at the display on the back, the camera is going to, as you change the settings from scene modes or from white balance settings to another one, the display will actually change along with it and show you in real time how it's changing the picture. How easy can that be? So I'm going to show you, and I just pushed the wrong button here. So we'll let the webcam kind of focus in, and I'm going to change. You can see the different scene modes, and take a look and see how those colors change. There's that must be snow. And remember I said snow overexposes? Well, it's overexposing that picture right now. So then we change into, there's beach. Okay, that's probably daylight. And wow, we have an underwater or aquarium. So anyway, you can use your own digital camera and you can change the white balance settings and see in advance exactly what's going to happen there. So play around with your camera and just see what it does. So anyway, hope that was useful. Okay, so we've talked about scene modes. We've talked about white balance. Again, all I can say is set your camera up in the same setting, take pictures of the same thing under the same light conditions, and just change the different settings on your camera and see what they do. So again, now we've got some time for questions. So if you want to shoot me off some questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And see what you have. While you're doing that, let me just give you an idea of what's coming. First of all, I'm going to try to stay away from Wednesday nights for these workshops from now on, because I got a lot of feedback on Facebook today. Different people couldn't make some of these. Now, I'm recording right now, and this is going to be available online, but I really like the opportunity that you have to chat and ask questions and interact. To me, that's one of the most important parts of this. So you obviously can't get to do that on a recorded session. So I want to make sure that I'm picking nights. So that leaves us with either Tuesday nights or Thursday nights. So if you want to give me any feedback on which night works better for you, that will certainly help too. I see a question here about, will using flash in shadows help the white balance? Great question. Flash is typically the neutral light. It's trying to be in that 5,000, 5,500 K color temperature, which is kind of right in the middle of daylight. And you also have, most cameras will have a flash white balance setting. So if the preponderance of your light is going to be from a flash, whether it's on the camera or external flashlights that you have, flash units that you may be using, you can use the flash white balance setting, and that will go a long way towards giving you a more natural picture. And so think about using that even if you're using flash in the shadows. And if you're inside and you've got tungsten light or you got fluorescent light, that can create some headaches for you, because flash is a different color than tungsten light and fluorescent lights. If you're outside, that probably will be pretty good. And again, that's where shooting in RAW or taking more control, use a white index card. Take a picture of that white index card with your incandescent lights and your flash unit, and then maybe use a custom white balance setting to set that there. Deb asking, what should you look for when purchasing an external flash unit? That's a course in itself. First of all, obviously it has to mount on the hot shoe of your camera. Your camera has to have the ability to accept an external flash, and here I'll show you my little Canon. It does. This right here is the hot shoe. So it's got to be compatible with whatever camera you have. And it's got to be powerful enough measured in watt seconds to be able to light up the area that you want to light up. And that has to do with distance and also your lens focal length. So Deb, maybe we talk on Facebook or we talk offline to give you more details about that, because that's a huge question. I think that's really more than what we have in our few remaining seconds here. But thanks for asking that. Looking through the other questions, don't see any that I haven't already addressed. And we're at about the end of our 45 minutes. So, oh yeah, back to current events. So yeah, I'm going to do Tuesdays or Thursday nights. Here's something else that I want to do. With this ability to live stream, so far I've been sitting here in my studio, and you've been looking at me and this camera here in the background, and every once in a while I have some props. I want to start doing some live location sessions as well. And here's the cool thing. I want to start doing some live broadcasts from hot air balloons when we're up in the air. So if you'd be interested in going on a hot air balloon ride from the comfort of your living room or wherever you're watching this, stay tuned for that. I'm going to start making arrangements to do some live streaming from different events. I have a bunch of different topics all lined up for additional workshops. I'm going to take a break next week because, speaking of hot air balloons, I'm going to be going to Monument Valley, Arizona, one of the most scenic places in the U.S., to do some photography at a hot air balloon event there. I'm also going to shoot some video, and we're going to put that up and make that available. So you might not be able to see it live, but you'll be able to see Monument Valley videos from the air in hot air balloons. So I'm going to try to do some documentary type stuff in that regard. So stay tuned for the next sessions. I want to try to continue in this kind of basic environment and build a really strong foundation of the basics of photography, both how to use your camera and from the art side of what makes an interesting photo, composition and things like that. So I want to cover those basics before we get into anything of great detail again. Also, I've set some dates at the Garden of the Gods Visitor and Nature Center where I do in-person workshops. And I'll put those dates on my Facebook page, but there's at the end of March, basically, they're going to be on Tuesdays at 11:30 in the morning. And I realize that may really be wacky for some of you with work schedules. But if you're free and you can go out to the Garden of the Gods roughly at lunchtime, we do a lunch and learn type setting there. And there's only room for about 20 people in the room that we have. And so I'll put a phone number out for reservations and things like that. So I've got that coming up. And again, some other live appearances and live workshops that I want to work on. Doing these kinds of sessions from a room that will hold 30 or 40 people. I've already been working on that. So a lot of stuff coming, and I think it's going to be great. I want to thank everybody who joined tonight. I'm just stunned that we keep getting some incredible numbers. I really appreciate you joining. I'm going to sign off on the video now, and I will stay active on chat for as long as there are that people have questions. Thank you again so much for joining, and please just spread the word and let's make this huge. Thank you so much again, and good night.